Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being with us this evening. All of us at Hospice of Santa Barbara are so grateful for your participation. This evening marks our second month of our new speakers series entitled Illuminate. Last month, we hosted Roshi Joan Halifax, who gave such a fantastic and moving talk. This evening, we're honored to have Frank Ostaseski join us for his second visit to Hospice of Santa Barbara. Both Frank and I come from similar backgrounds. I worked in HIV/AIDS during the difficult years of very little treatment in Santa Barbara locally, and Frank worked up in San Francisco, truly making a national impact of those suffering from HIV/AIDS. It's truly an honor to have his presence with us tonight. Now, before we bring Frank on, I'd like to introduce Charles Caldwell, my colleague and friend here at Hospice of Santa Barbara, who will share a few things, and then Charles will bring it back to me. Charles?
Thanks, David. It's great to be here tonight, and I'm excited to hear Frank soon. We created the Illuminate Speaker Series to reflect the needs of our community as people have been struggling with this time of change and challenge. And we're very excited to be able to do so, but it's only made possible by supporters like you. If you'd like to help ensure the future of this series, please consider making a donation, and you can see the information below at the bottom of your screen now. Thank you so much. And David, back to you.
Thank you, Charles. And now I have the pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague at Hospice of Santa Barbara, Suzanne Retzinger. Suzanne is a longtime grief counselor with our organization. And through her work, she's also known and worked with Frank Ostaseski for many years. So I have the pleasure now to introduce you, Suzanne. Thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you, David. It's my honor to introduce Frank Ostaseski. Frank is an internationally respected Buddhist teacher and visionary, co-founder of Zen Hospice Project, and founder of the Metta Institute. He's lectured at Harvard Medical School, the Mayo Clinic, and leading corporations, as well as teaches at major spiritual centers around the world. Frank is the 2018 recipient of the prestigious Humanities Award from the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Care Medicine. He has accompanied well over 1,000 people through the dying process and trained thousands in healthcare clinicians and family caregivers around the world. Frank's work has been featured on the Bill Moyers series, On Our Own Terms, highlighted on the Oprah Show, and has been honored by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He is the author of the 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. I first met Frank in 2006 when I applied to the Metta Institute. And remember that first weekend in January being moved by Frank's 5 invitations and realized I don't have as much control in my life as I like to believe. And what was important for me in this is that I began to question, how can I be with what is without creating further suffering? His work continues to impact my life and my work here at Hospice of Santa Barbara. Frank is a man whose integrity contributes to a kinder and gentler world. He is a dear friend of Hospice of Santa Barbara and is dear to my own heart. We are delighted to welcome Frank back to our community.
Oh boy, thank you, everyone. That's very kind introductions. I'm never quite sure who people are talking about when they make such kind introductions. So our subject tonight is a subject of the heart, you know. Our subject tonight is grief. And sometimes I want to say that our grief is about what we've had and lost. And sometimes it's about what we never got to have. You know, there are funerals waiting for close to 250,000 people in our country who have died of COVID-related illnesses. words of love that have gone unexpressed, losses that have gone unmarked. You know, yesterday, a friend of mine watched her father die on an iPad. He took his last breaths while she pressed her face against the screen in some kind of surreal attempt at intimacy and connection. There are weddings and commitment ceremonies and celebrations of love that are postponed or canceled. Formal graduation ceremonies to acknowledge people's accomplishments that can't happen. Terrible suffering. You know, one of my students in Italy fell ill with the coronavirus, and because she was ill, she couldn't visit her parents, her elderly parents. And a few weeks later, both her parents died of COVID-related illnesses. And their bodies were removed from their home into a mobile morgue. A funeral wasn't possible. And her grieving ritual was returning to their empty apartment, absent of their presence, to pack up their belongings. In these days, you know, in these troubling times we're in the midst of, we're not only deprived of receiving comfort from others in our most vulnerable moments, but we're also deprived of giving comfort to others. And as humans, that's a deep need that we have to both receive and give comfort. And their grief, it's not just about these deaths, the deaths of our family or friends that we might be experiencing. There's so many different kinds of losses happening. Loss of identity, loss of status, loss of role, loss of due to changes in your work, loss of relationship. I mean, how many of us have read about multiple divorces and breakups? And probably we all know other relationships, maybe including our own, that are being strained to the breaking point. There's loss of our colleagues, there's loss of in-person community gatherings. There's loss of dreams, loss of faith that was once strong and unshakable and now feels a bit dim. Maybe there's loss of hope or courage. You know, collectively, and it's really important to recognize that collectively we are experiencing a global, pervasive sense of loss. One that's difficult to name. It's a kind of ambiguous loss. And it's related not just to the loss of a place or a person, but to daily routines, to being physically separated from those we love. Of course, there's the related economic disaster that's causing unprecedented hardship. And it's all that's happening in our country, you know, the racial tension, the chaos, all of it happening against a background of a kind of moral crisis that's occurring. So we feel the stress and the frustration, and it's complicated. It's the kind of grief that we're experiencing is especially challenging because it's not necessarily about something like the death of a friend. It's about more intangible aspects. The inability to separate our work from our home, the playtime with our kids from homeschooling them. The boundaries between what we know and what we don't know that will keep us safe, what will ultimately protect us from this deadly virus. So much is unclear, right? We feel like it's like the earth is shifting beneath our feet, and it's confusing and paradoxical. People I work with, they tell me, I hate sheltering at home, but I love having uninterrupted time with my wife. I feel really fortunate that my family is safe, but I feel guilty that others have lost so much. The psychologist Pauline Boss, she names all this this type of loss and corresponding distress as ambiguous loss, and it's confusing and disorienting, and it saps us of our energy and attention. And then there's another kind of loss. In California, in other parts of the West, we've been devastated by wildfires. And other parts of the country are dealing with floods and hurricanes that push COVID to the back burner. We're experiencing solastalgia, a term that was created to give greater meaning and clarity to environmentally caused distress and grief and loss. Solastalgia is the anxiety or the stress that's produced by environmental change. It's sometimes called climate homesickness. Look, to grieve is to be human. When we do not grieve, we hardly exist. And the question that emerges for me around suffering and loss is always, how do we move toward the light of absolute truth and still accept and honor our very human nature? I don't think it's by suppressing our grief, nor by attempting some kind of spiritual bypass around what's difficult and confusing, or to try and avoid the dark emotions that often follow great losses. Maybe we've got friends who tell us, just let go. Well, that's great advice, but there's no letting go until there's letting in. So maybe a wiser and more compassionate approach is to trust the process of grief and to recognize it, as a path to wholeness. Allowing the grief allows us to pass through to non-grieving. In the Buddhist tradition that I come from, in the old texts, there's an accounting of the monk's response to the Buddha's death. And it looks to me like a pretty good description of the spectrum of responses that we might have to the loss of someone we love. And paraphrasing the text, it goes something like this. I don't recall exactly, but it says, that there were monks who had not yet overcome their passions. And they wept, and they tore out their hair, and they threw up their arms, and they fell to the ground, twisting and turning and weeping. And then there were monks who were free from craving, and they endured mindfully, and they reflected on the truth of impermanence. And then it's followed by some advice that's always troubled me, actually. Not because it's not true, but because, well, it's easily misunderstood. And because advice rarely helps when it comes to grief. One of the old, more venerable monks said, enough of this weeping and wailing, He kind of scolded them. He said, stop all this, we were told that everything was impermanent. Coming together inevitably means parting. So why all this, my friends? What is born is subject to dying. All of this is true. And, speaking for myself, I might have preferred to identify with the monks who were free from craving, but it's more likely I'd find myself with the ones who were wailing, as I've done in these past months during the pandemic when friends and others have died. For me, if I were there at the Buddha's death, I'd have found it much more helpful if someone just sat beside me and listened, accompanied me in my sorrow. I believe that if that happened, I could feel their love and concern. I could feel the care of someone that didn't want me to be any different. I could feel the pulse of life in their company as a kind of encouragement in mine. And that kind of heart-to-heart exchange with someone, it could only be possible if that person really understood that we're connected in our suffering. And that kind of heart-to-heart exchange, you know, it'd be a lot more valuable to me than 1,000 truthful words. If I had that kind of generous listening, and that kind of tender-hearted accompaniment, I think I might be able to look up from my hands and maybe I'd see compassion in their eyes. And then perhaps we could stand up together and walk together toward the inevitable pain of embracing the truth of loss. Don't make believe that you're not feeling it. Let the grief happen. Allow yourself to feel it completely. The more you try to push it away, the more it clings. We can develop a spaciousness of mind around it. We can be aware of the grief. And when we have that kind of awareness, the grief has room to move, to unfold, to show itself to us in all its faces. You know, there's a lot of comparison going on now about loss. You know, who's got it worst? I miss hugging my granddaughter. I'm tired of apocalyptic dreams. I want to go to the movies. I want to comfort that look of fear in my beautiful bride's eyes and reassure her that I will not get sick and die if I go to the corner store. I mean, doesn't this grief count? A friend of mine says, grief needs to be a non-judgmental zone. Comparing doesn't help. Every loss is unique. This invisible virus, you know, it's changed everything. You know, some of us feel frightened that our parents will get sick, wary of other people's behaviors, angry at the government's incompetent response. Our mind races with worst case scenarios sometimes. Mine does. And our primitive animal body senses something's dangerous, something's wrong. The future's uncertain. There's a perceived loss of safety. We know that some of these losses are temporary, but it doesn't always feel that way. So what helps? Well, we're not victims. We can calm ourselves. We can come into this present moment. We can resource our innate compassion. We can make wise choices. We can feel deeply. We can share our grief with others. There's a power in naming our grief. We can inhabit some silence and some aloneness. We can trust our innate compassion will rise up to accompany, to help us with our suffering. We can have confidence in the kindness of our essential hearts. And we can appreciate that they will be a reliable guide. What else helps? What helps to understand that vulnerability is not weakness. Trying to get rid of our vulnerability is a conceit. It cuts us off from our hearts. It makes it difficult for us to be with our own or other people's grief. We need to understand that living well is not about eradicating our wounds and weaknesses. It's about understanding how they complete our identity, how they equip us to help others, how they enable us to build an empathetic bridge to other people's suffering. Vulnerability introduces us to humility. And that's a gateway to knowing and eventually to healing. That's what allows us to move from the experience of isolation and fragmentation and turn toward, or return, we could say, to a sense of wholeness. It helps to be lovingly aware of what's happening in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, when we're sad, when we're confused, when there's anxiety or fear. It helps to hold the paradox, to understand that grace and grit are partners. It helps to recognize that grief challenges our notions of control. It cracks our defensive shell of vulnerability and exposes the ways that we try to hide from our human frailty. Think about it. How often do you choose comfort over truth? You know what else helps? It helps to see that we have individual and cultural habits around managing grief. You know, we're generally afraid and impatient, and our own unexplored fear leads us to hurrying other people along through their grief. But grief has its own schedule. It has its own unique rhythm. You know, it's a slow process of the soul. It can't be rushed. You know, when I was being introduced, we talked about the AIDS epidemic, and there I worked with thousands of people who died. And sometimes I'd work with 30 or 40 people in a week who died. And there was tremendous grief in me. And I did three things. I sat on my meditation cushion, and that helped stabilize me and regulate my emotional upheaval. That was great, but it wasn't enough. So I went for body work every week. And I had a really great body worker who wasn't trying to do anything to me. And I'd walk into his office and he'd say, "Where today, Frank?" And I'd say, "Just here on my shoulder. Could you just put your hand there?" And I'd lay on his massage table and he'd just put his hand on my shoulder and he'd keep it there for an hour. And I would weep on the table. And then I'd get up and I'd say, "See you next week." And he'd say, "Yeah." And we didn't talk about it, but there was something about the touch and the relational aspect of this experience that was really helpful for me in working with my grief. And then I did this other thing. I'd go to the hospital, our county hospital, where I knew all the nurses, you know, and I'd go up to the maternity ward. And there were babies that were born to mothers who were addicted to crack or alcohol. And these babies would just shake, you know, and I'd sit in this rocking chair and I would hold these babies. Oh, then I would just rock them and stroke their throats and bellies until finally the shaking would stop. And that was incredibly helpful to me because it was a kind of suffering that I could relieve. I could do something about it. And it wasn't always possible for me to relieve the suffering of the people that I was working with who were dying of AIDS. It helps not to hold models of grief recovery too tightly. We do that in our country, and it's foolish. We impose maps on an individual's grief. And when we do that, we do them a great disservice. Maybe we even cause them more harm with our well-intentioned efforts. Grief is a part of the human condition. You know, it's always curious to me that we talk about managing our grief or getting over our grief, but we never talk about managing our joy or getting over our joy. Grief is just part of our experience. Look, it helps to know that grief is the way we love a person, an object, or an activity that we miss. It helps to know that grief is a love that has no place to go. You know, it helps to listen generously, to listen in a devout way. When we do that, it helps draw the truth out of the other person. And sometimes they need to tell their story 10,000 times. That's not wallowing in grief. It's a way we express our love. So we listen and we inquire without agenda. Look, grief can open us. Whatever we give space to can move. It can unfold. It can show itself. It can be revealed. And it can be healed. The willingness to experience, to investigate our pain, it gives rise to compassion, to kindness. And that loving attention, it melts our well-constructed defenses. And we begin to invite the pain into our hearts, where it can be held in loving awareness. Look, in our grief, we access parts of ourselves that were somehow unavailable to us in the past. And so the journey to grief, it leads us to a profound understanding that takes us beyond our individual loss. It can open us to the really essential truths of life, the truth of impermanence, of constant change, the real causes of our suffering, and the illusion, the delusion that we're somehow separate from each other. And in the process, we learn to fully appreciate that this life is absolutely precarious. And that brings us into contact with just how precious it is. And then we don't want to miss a moment of it. Look, there's no right way to grieve. There's only your way. I don't want to keep talking. I want to have a dialogue with you, but I want to share with you a poem by Ellen Bass, who I really love, a great California poet. And she wrote a great poem called The Thing Is. And it goes like this: the thing is to love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it. And everything you held dear crumbles like burnt paper in your hands, and your throat filled with the silt of it. When grief sits with you, its tropical heat thickening the air, heavy as water, more fit for gills than lungs. When grief weighs you down like your own flesh, only more of it. And you think, how can the body withstand this? And then you hold life like a face between your palms. A plain face. No charming smile, no violet eyes. And you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. The Thing Is, by Ellen Bass. There's no one way to grieve. There's only your way. So I want to stop these formal comments now and just have time to visit with you and have a bit of a dialogue together. So you're welcome to put a question in the chat as was described to you at the beginning, but you know, I'd also like to be able to visit with you. I'd like to talk to you heart to heart. So I'm going to count on the great, good skills of Rahuli to move us along through this process. You know, recently I suffered a series of strokes, and so I can't see hardly at all. I had lost half my vision, and I can't figure out computers hardly at all. So I'm going to depend on you, Rahuli, to guide me through this process, okay?
Thank you so much, Frank.
Oh, David, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Your words are grounding and they're centering and they feel inspiring. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have the pleasure now to introduce a friend of mine for a long, long time, Rodalie Weininger. Rodalie is a clinical psychologist. She's a teacher of deep mindfulness and compassion meditation and Buddhist psychology. She's also the co-founder and the guiding teacher of a nonprofit called Mindful Heart Program in Santa Barbara, locally in our town. And so now I have the pleasure to bring Rodalie on to have a conversation with you, Frank. And Rodalie, are you there?
Frank, thank you so much for this heartfelt, soul-felt talk. You brought me right back to 1988, 89 in San Francisco, when as a young psychology student, I gave groups for men with AIDS in Holy Redeemer in the Castro. And I would say that that was the time when I felt my heart deepening and expanding, and being with this grief, with these men, with these families really helped me in a way to be here now, to be present with the grief that we are all experiencing at this point. And it seems that our grief widens and deepens our heart. I want to invite you all to dialogue with Frank and to speak up and speak out and type in your questions and maybe ask your question live. That would be really wonderful to have this very precious, direct, immediate dialogue. First, I want to come to Jean West, who wants to ask a question. Jean, would you please unmute yourself, and we will bring you forward so we can see you.
Oh,
Good evening, Frank. And thank you once again for being such an inspiration to us all. There are over 500 people listening to you tonight, so you're touching many lives. I'd like to say personally that your words touch my heart and your passion touches my soul. My question for you: there's no letting go until there's letting in. Give this listening audience some real practical tools that you've used or that you've experienced yourself through the process of grief.
Oh, Jean, thank you for the question. I don't know that I have so many tools, Jean. I mean, yeah, it's true. I've got some things, right? I mean, I've developed some skills over the years. I don't lead with my expertise, Jean. I lead with my humanity. Like when I'm with somebody who's grieving or really broken up, I don't give them tips. I listen. I listen as generously as I possibly can. And I try and see myself in them, and I try and see them in me. And when I do that, the nature of the relationship fundamentally shifts. And then we're kind of in the soup together, And then I become a trustworthy refuge for them. Yeah. To let in means to allow. Yeah. And that's a really different word than accept or reject. Accept has that, that feeling of like rejection could come at any moment. Allowing is different. It's kind of softer, right? It's like it makes room for. We could think of it that way. It just makes room for. It doesn't try and solve it or fix it or chase it away. It just makes room for it. So when I allow something, when I allow it, it's not such an enemy anymore. Mm-hmm. It's like a guest. It's a guest in my house. And I don't have to agree with it or I don't have to like it, like it's the way it is with guests sometimes, but I allow it. I allow it. And then it can show itself to me. Then it can really show me all its faces. Like sometimes our grief is about sadness, but sometimes it's about anger or numbness or, this feeling of total confusion. So it doesn't look like one thing, grief. And so I have to be careful not to try and push any kind of agenda here. Yeah. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts in response.
I'm going to take 3 clues from that. Allow, listen, and be human.
Okay, great. Good.
Well, thank you, Frank, for this wonderful question
Yeah.
and answer. And it is really about the tenderness of the heart. And here's a very tender question by Penny Somerville. And she asked me to read the question for her. So I will do this. She says, I lost my 27-year-old son 6 months ago to suicide. Some days it feels like I can't breathe. I do feel like I'm coping a bit better, but I was wondering if you have a suggestion that helps parents survive this.
Oh, God. Oh, Penny, this is kind of impossible. It feels impossible. I mean, this is every parent's worst nightmare. Yeah. And, we can't attend to this with tips and tricks. And that's what happens, I think, in our country. And it happens in bereavement groups too much, is people are busy trying to fix it, and get it all resolved. This is impossible for a mother. And so the first thing is to recognize that, to step forward to that and just feel the impossibility of it, to feel like you can't even come near it, It's just too much. And so that's a kindness to yourself sometimes, to see that I can't come near this yet. And sometimes you just have to walk around it, kind of look at it, keep your distance from it a little bit until you can feel comfortable enough to go closer. You got to let yourself feel how much you love him. Yeah. That's the thing. I mean, when you lose somebody, as you did suddenly, especially like this, it's not a single event. You keep losing him, right? I mean, when you go, when Thanksgiving dinner comes next week, you lose him again. It's not a one-time thing. When you see other healthy 27-year-olds driving down the block, you lose them again. Yeah. So it's an ongoing experience. And what's useful to remember about that, Penny, is that your relationship with him doesn't stop because he's died. That it keeps going. And it's not just the sorrow. You have a relationship with him, you keep working it out with him. You keep finding space for his life and his choices. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with them right away. You might be really angry at him. That's a face of grief, and it's an okay face of grief. So little bit at a time, and keep remembering that the relationship continues and the grief continues, and it might not end. That's an idea we have, that grief is going to neatly get tied up with a bow and there's going to be some kind of closure. It's not my experience. My experience is that I learned to live with grief, and that it inhabits my life, and it enables me to be more tender in the world, actually. So keep remembering what you love about your child. Yeah. Remember your child as a small infant. Remember what it was like to nestle him against your breast, and how you felt like you were one being sometimes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
In my private practice, I see so many young people suffering, dying, being emotionally and physically ill, and with them, their parents.
Yeah.
And it feels to me that we will see so much more as our society goes through these painful shifts. Is there something you might say to us how to hold as a community this deeper suffering?
Oh, it's a good question, but I don't think we know yet. I don't think we know. I think we'd be jumping too quickly to imagine that we understand how to do this. All we can do is feel our way into it. I say it's like the Braille method. You can't know it in advance. You just put your hands on it and you feel your way through the experience. Yeah. Look, we didn't know in the midst of the AIDS epidemic what the effect would be. We didn't know that the AIDS quilt would emerge as a collective grieving ritual. We don't know what that grieving ritual will be for us yet, but it's going to come. It's going to emerge out of the compassionate hearts of our collective grief. And we will know it, and we will live into it, and we will not be lost. We will not be lost. But we have to let ourselves feel it, and we have to let ourselves see it in each other, and let it join us in this kind of collective experience that we're going through. This isn't the first time. We think this is unprecedented, and it's not unprecedented. This isn't the first time that the world's population has gone through devastation like this. And we can learn from that history, but we're going to have to discover now. Have to discover, what is this calling forward in us? And I think that our wise hearts will guide us. Okay, what else? What else is on people's hearts and minds?
Thank you so much for your answer, Frank. And there's Asha who likes to ask you directly. Asha, please, would you unmute yourself and we will bring you forward.
Yes, Asha, I can even see you.
I appreciate.
I can see your puppy too.
Well, that's my dear puppy. I appreciate you bringing dignity to grief, not sterility, not cleaning it up, but a dignity. So I'm an Easterner, and I appreciate we bathe our dead. We bring dignity. And in the Christian ritual, in the Eastern tradition, we bathe, we carry the body to the church and the cemetery. It's a dignity. But I'm both an Episcopal priest and a therapist, and there is great difficulty, especially in this pandemic, people not able to grieve because they believe being all alone, they will have a breakdown and not a breakthrough. And the fear of the breakdown prevents them from any healthy grief, moving through the grief. Yeah. So they become very frozen in the fear, and that creates more breakdown, not a breakthrough. Yeah. Any thoughts on that distinction? Because I think it's a big distinction for all of us. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Asha. Grief is messy. And sometimes I think, I appreciate what you said about dignity, but it's messy, and I'm hesitant, to subject anybody to my model about what will help them. I trust their souls, I think that the best thing we can do is help them find their own resourcefulness and to trust it, and sometimes we got to freeze for a while. It's like when people are when folks are dying and they're busy trying to get them to acceptance, so they can check that box. Acceptance isn't the end. Acceptance is just the beginning. When people are dying and they come to acceptance, it's just the beginning. And after acceptance comes appreciably deeper dimensions. There comes a kind of chaos when we're dying after acceptance, where the sense of self just breaks down, and all the ways we've defined ourselves, all the roles we've carried in our lives, they fall apart, and we don't know who we are. And that's a kind of chaos, and a deeper dimension arises out of that chaos. A deep surrender arises, and that surrender is a kind of humility. that you know from your Episcopalian priest role. That's the heart of transformation. And so you can't push that. Just like you can't push somebody in the dying process, you can't push somebody in their grieving process. You got to be able to stay with them in all the different steps, including the times in which they feel frozen. And you can point to the door. You can point to what's possible. Of course, that's your responsibility. But you got to stay in the room with them until they're ready to go through the door. You know, you got to stay in the room when the going gets rough. That's the land of unanswerable questions. Yeah. And it frightens us. And so we want to have a model, but actually just stay still, be a loving rock in that moment. Yeah. Be a loving rock in that moment.
Thank you, Frank. I really love your idea of staying in the room with those who are suffering, not running away, not distracting, just being there. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Here is Raja, who asked me to speak for her. She
Oh,
says, thanks, Frank. So helpful. My mom, sister, and I are all online. I'm in Santa Barbara. My sister's in New York. My mom in New Jersey. They're all there. We lost our dad, husband in April of this year. When you talk about different ways to grieve, we can all relate. We express our grief differently, however. Some more open and expressive, others more reserved and inward. How do you move on?
yeah.
At some point, this has to happen, right?
Well,
And we are looking
okay.
for some help here.
You know, in the Jewish tradition, especially in the old country, there's a kind of model of grieving. You know, when people sit Shiva, you know, that ritual, where you come into the house where someone has died, and you know, traditionally the mirrors are covered and the clocks are covered, and the men don't shave and the women don't put on makeup, so there's nothing to distract us from the experience of grief. That's what Shiva is all about. And when you come in, you sit on, traditionally you sit on wooden boxes, you know, but basically you take your cue from the grieving family. If they tell a joke, you laugh. You know, if they cry, you weep with them. If they need to tell stories of their loved one, you listen. Yeah. There is a part of this process that's really instructive. And that is that after that week, what happens is that the family gets up and they walk around the block, they walk through the neighborhood. And so that the rest of the community can see them. And it signals not that grief is over, but that a particular period of mourning is coming to a close, and that they know they have to re-enter the world. Yeah, that's essential. And there's not really a 7-day time frame on that, of course. But yes, it's true, we have to re-enter the world, but we're gonna re-enter the world differently. We're not gonna come back to the way it was. That's an illusion. We are reconstituted by grief. We are changed by the journey through grief. There's no going back. And the attention to the grief is the moving on. It is the moving on. By allowing it, by feeling it, by expressing it, by coming to know it intimately, that is the moving on. That's how it gets included in our life. We don't put it behind us. We integrate it, we metabolize it, it becomes part of who we are. Yeah. Okay, I hope that's helpful. And I'm so glad your family is together. And you know, isn't technology a pain in the ass? And isn't it wonderful that we have it tonight to connect us all over the country? Yeah.
Here's Christine, who asks me to ask for her.
Oh, I want the brave
Says,
people who want
I
to
have a 41-year-old daughter with special needs.
Oh.
She's here on this planet, and I look at her and I grieve for what I perceive as a poor quality of life, for the system of care that I feel is broken, and I'm grieving for the fact that I cannot care for her. And I'm very, very sad. I'm having a hard time staying present when I eat, when I sleep. How do I care for myself when I can't care for her?
Yeah. Okay. Well, these are challenging situations, and it's really hard for me to guide you when I can't see you. I mean, if I were looking at you, I would see your face, and I would see maybe the trembling in your chin, or the color of your skin change as you spoke. And that would show me what you needed most, you know? So it's hard to answer these questions conceptually, right? Because grief isn't conceptual, it's a body experience. It's a felt experience. It's not a mental construct. So the first thing in what you shared with me about your daughter is that you see that it's difficult for you to see how she can have a valuable life. I'm paraphrasing. But years ago when I was a teenager, I worked in a school for severely disabled children. I taught swimming, in the school, and I'd had a hard life. I had a miserable life. I had a crazy family, and it was a lot of pain. And I taught at this school where kids were severely disabled, and I was a swimming teacher, lifeguard. And there was this one girl who would come into the swimming pool every day. She had spina bifida, and she didn't want to come in the pool. She was self-conscious about her body and her twisted legs. And, she was a beautiful 16-year-old teenage girl. And so she used to come and she'd sort of flirt with the lifeguard, honestly. And, and I'd encourage her to come in, and I'd reflect to her beauty and her resourcefulness and her intelligence, because sometimes you have to reteach a thing its loveliness, the poet says. And she'd come in some days and she'd take off her heavy braces and her orthopedic shoes, and she'd dip her toes in the pool, and that's as close as she would get. But I kept reflecting her extraordinariness to her. And that's what I recommend you do with your daughter. And then one day when I was in the pool, out came this girl in her wheelchair in a turquoise blue bathing suit, and she wheeled herself over to the pool, and she slipped out of her wheelchair and onto the marble, side of the pool. She pulled me over, and she leapt into my arms like a 7-year-old. Yeah. Oh boy. Sometimes when we're sick or we have a disability, we feel completely unlovable. We feel betrayed by our bodies. And my 2 cents is love that being with all your heart until they can love themselves again. Yeah. That's what's worked for me in my life, and I've seen it work for a lot of other people. Love her until she can love herself again. Value her just as she is. And the same goes for you, by the way. In this confusion, in this sadness that you have, we have to find something bigger than the grief. And the only thing that I know is the space of loving awareness. That's bigger than the grief, that can hold the grief. Yeah. Look, I'm speaking to you, but I'm also speaking to everybody on the call right now. There was a beautiful, very famous English pediatrician and psychologist, Donald Winnicott, and he developed this idea of the holding environment, he called it. And it's what happens when a child, like a toddler, is just learning to walk. We've all seen them, and they fall down and they scratch their knee on the sidewalk or something. And the mothering person, a mother or father, comes along and holds them up, right? And holds them close to their chest and rocks them and lets them know that they're loved and that they're safe, and there's a healthy attachment with that child. And that's called the holding environment, right? And inevitably what you see when children are held that way is that they go beyond their previously limiting ideas of what they could do. And our awareness could be for us a loving, holding environment. Our awareness can expand to such a way that it can hold our grief. It can embrace our grief. It can carry it in love. And then what might be possible for us if we allowed our awareness to be such a loving, holding environment? Might it enable us to go further than we imagined possible? Might it enable us to do things we didn't think we could possibly do? I think so. I think so. So
Here's Jay Thomason, who wants
Okay,
to
great.
speak to you. Please, Jay, unmute yourself and we'll bring
Okay.
you forward.
Hello, dear Frank.
Oh, hi, Jay.
How are you, dear one?
Oh, it's good to see you and your good
It
heart.
is so good to see you too. I put a question up. I mean, you know my grief and you know me well. And, after my wife died, I picked up and I moved from my state and all my friends and my job. And so I had all these griefs, and I've been finding myself running away from them, and I want to find my way back. And I don't know how to do that, Frank. I just feel so lost, and I feel alone out here. And I know, where I am is in my best interest and I can find my way back. But I know I've been running more than I've been trying to find my way back. And I want to be, and the other thing is that I found that people are tired of my grief, or it feels like that.
Okay.
And I don't know what to do with that either.
All right. Jay, that's really good. And I'm gonna out you and say that you're in Hawaii at the moment, and that you moved there. That was part of that was a healthy thing for you to do. But I understand this thing about running from our grief. There's a famous Buddhist story that I told you once about a murderer, Angulimala, and he in the time of the Buddha, he was a murderer, and just horrible. And the Buddha went by him once, and Angulimala started chasing him to catch him, and he was going to murder him. And the Buddha understood this in his magical way, mystical way. But as fast as Angulimala chased him, he couldn't catch up with the Buddha. And he said, "Stop, monk," like that to the Buddha. And the monk said, and Buddha said, "I have stopped, Angulimala. Now you have to stop. You have to stop. You have to stop and turn toward your experience." And in a way, that's your work, Jay. It's to trust your good heart. I know your heart, and I know it's a reliable refuge. It won't let you down, Jay. You just get scared. And that's what makes us run. And you trained with me, so I know you, and I've known you for 25 years or more. And the thing that really I use more than anything, I didn't get trained as a psychologist. My training came from people who were dying. And this is one thing I learned. When you go in the room, sit down. And you sit down because you're less likely to run away if you sit down. It's harder to run away. So sit down with yourself, Jay. Sit down with yourself. Keep good company with yourself. Know that the frightened part of you is not all that you are. Jay, that when your awareness is able to observe your fear, that the awareness is not afraid. And you can function from the fear, or you can function from the awareness. Yeah. The part of you that's aware of your fear is not scared. And that's your ally. Yeah. And yes, people will be, they're scared of you. They're tired of your stories, and they want you to move on and get a dog or get a new relationship or take up, hula dancing or something, That's their fear. You don't need their fear. That's their fear. You pay attention to what's actually here for you. You watch, you sense your body, you feel your good heart. You watch your mind. You allow your loving awareness to be a holding environment for you. And let it embrace you and everything the whole storm that wants to come. Okay? Thank you. I love you. And I'm so glad that you chose to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
thank you, Jay, for being so brave to come forward and to speak to us. And thank you, Frank, for this really lively, wonderful, heartfelt, soul-felt interaction amongst us all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you very much for moderating also, old friend. Good to see you. And thank you to Hospice of Santa Barbara for organizing this and making it, you know, such an extraordinary series. It's just a phenomenal thing. This is a good example of hospices not just being caregiving organizations. When you sit at the precipice of death with people, you learn things. You learn things that the culture needs. And so then you share it with the culture as you're doing through this series. So your work isn't just to be caregivers, your work is to be wisdom keepers. And so I really want to applaud you for doing this. And pardon me if I take us a little over time, but I wanted to say that out loud so that not only the hospice workers understand that as their role, but the community understands what a resource they have. And so thank you very much for doing that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you so much, Rodalie. Truly, truly moving. This was a very intimate, powerful conversation. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you tonight for being with us. There are literally hundreds of you that were with Frank tonight and with us. We're deeply grateful. And I also want to give a very special thanks to our sponsors of our Illuminate speaker series. Those sponsors that are supporting the entire series include the Natalie Orfala Foundation, Lou Buglioli, our friends at the Ridley Tree Cancer Center, and also Mindful Magazine. All these folks are supporting us for the entire series. And all of us at Hospice of Santa Barbara, we're able to offer this series only because of the generosity of folks like you. So if you're able to make a donation, big or small, we would be so grateful for that. Just go to the method below me on the screen, and it'll guide you through making a contribution. And we have more speakers coming up. So please visit our website. You have to sign up and register for these talks. They are free, but you have to register beforehand. So please do that. And thank you. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Frank, for being with us this evening.